One of the biggest differences between the anime, manhwa, and web novel is the state of mind in which Sung Jin Woo finds himself in. His level of power is generally the same, but there's a distinct way in which he chooses to approach combat in each of them. The anime and manhwa has him struggle and be a bit more cautious, whereas in the novel the instance dungeon was nothing more than a cakewalk. A simple XP farm in which he was literally spawn trapping. So if you want to see Sung's gamer moves and the more fleshed out methods he chose to level up here, stick around as we'll go through all the changes the anime made. Let's get started. Episode 4, I Gotta Get Stronger, covering chapters 13 to 16 from the web novel and chapters 14 to 17 from the manhwa. To start things out right here at the entrance of the instance dungeon, with Sung's initial plan being to simply check out the dungeon then leave, the fact it trapped him inside made him panic. Not that short-lived shock we got in the anime, but instead straight up terror as he screamed and punched the invisible wall in front of him. The whole thing was far beyond what he had originally planned for, because what he expected to find was a gate or secret entrance somewhere, not this significantly worse scenario in which he couldn't even escape anymore. It's when he finally commits to the challenge ahead of him that the first major difference is with the goblins. If you've read the manhwa or read the books, you'd know that these goblins weren't an enemy inherent to the dungeon. The reason I think the anime decided to include them then was because, as the enemy we've seen Sung fight and lose to twice before, they serve as this base level marker for Sung's starting point. They're the only enemy we know he can sort of handle, and it's that knowledge that makes his fight with them a good indicator of how strong he's become so far. So, by seeing him fight and defeat them easily now, we know at the very least that Sung is stronger and more competent than he was before. Now, it's his first encounter with the wolf that's when we get to that first major difference in Sung's state of mind I was talking about. You see, in the manhwa and anime, Sung was a bit more passive and let enemies get the jump on him, but it was in the novels that he did the opposite. He could sense that something was stalking him, and though he didn't know exactly where it was, he knew from experience it was waiting for an opportunity. An opportunity Sung would give by faking an opening, then immediately reverse by swinging his sword right as the lichen jumped out, one-shotting the beast in a swift reflex that impressed even himself. That's another difference from the manhwa and anime, but as I had mentioned last video, the sword was something Sung was already aware of. He had equipped the weapon as soon as he entered and was ready to use it straight from the get-go. Two more lichens would then jump out right after the first, and despite Sung's sword being stuck just like in the anime, Sung had no problem abandoning it so he could swing his fist instead. Unlike how the lichens were able to withstand it in the anime though, that single punch was enough to one-shot it too, exploding its head the moment his fist made impact with it. Now, you may be wondering how that was even possible, but the core reason behind it is because in the novels the lichens' names were white. They weren't red to show that they were significantly stronger, but instead immediately white to indicate that they were already weaker than Sung. So, though the anime and the novel had the same strength stat for Sung, it seems the power of the lichens they were facing was different. The anime's obviously being a little bit harder and the novels being somewhat easier. That's not to discount the confidence and experience Sung had displayed while fighting them in the novels though, but there was a much more gradual progression towards that confidence in the anime. As for the manhwa, it was here that they decided to keep Sung's strength at 20 in the beginning. A decision I think makes the most sense for when Sung was actually struggling, since to have his strength at 30 would mean he should really be one-shotting them. What I mean is that a strength of 30 plus doesn't properly reflect the power of someone who's level 2. As Sung determined himself, his glass cannon strength build placed his power more akin to someone who was level 20. So what do you get when a level 2 hunts with the strength of a level 20 in the beginner area? Well, that's what Sung believed to be power leveling. He'd effectively tripled his power stat and was now abusing that power to farm levels here. To say his actual power was tripled from what it was initially though, wasn't entirely accurate since Sung felt he was even stronger than that. You see, back at the hospital he'd tested the difference between 1 or 2 points, but now that that strength had increased threefold, he knew for sure the amount it was increasing each time wasn't linear. To him it felt like it was more of an exponential boost in power, a level of growth that only got faster the farther along you were. So, with that being the only explanation for his newly acquired destructive power, Sung also figured his significant boost in speed was because of the strength attribute too. What he initially thought was all agility, in actuality had nothing to do with agility. His strength was increasing his muscles, and that in turn was also making him faster. So, what exactly does the agility stat do then? Well, that's something Sung knew he'd have to use points to find out. a price he wasn't willing to pay since why bother when strength already does what he thought agility did. Of course, he could always find out just by leveling, so that was his plan to figure out what all his attributes did. Sure, the increase to them would be marginal at the beginning, but over time he knew eventually a difference would be felt. Now, Sung was pretty disappointed that there weren't any essence stones, since for many the whole point of being a hunter was to gather these essence stones. To him, it just felt wrong to walk away empty-handed from a hunt like this. It was the first indicator this dungeon was fundamentally different from a gate. Luckily, they did give him drops instead, but with no context on what the gold they were sold for was worth, Sung could only hope that their value would eventually add up to something better. He was the type of player to gather anything and everything no matter how invaluable it was. In fact, he had even become a bit sad when he realized 20 gold was left on the table from that lichen whose head he punched off. That disappointment didn't last very long though, as when he turned around to find 20 more lichens, his face lit up at the thought of how much gold he was about to get. He was ecstatic to see so many more mobs waiting to get farmed by him. A stark contrast from the nervous anxiety Sung proceeded with in the anime. Whereas he was happy for a fair fight and challenge there, in the novels Sung's greed shone through as all he could think about was what he could gain from them. So this would constitute the entirety of the dungeon's first floor, and by the end Sung had gone up to level 7. His stats had gone up to what you see here, and the only drops he got were the ones we saw in the anime. Sung surprisingly didn't suffer from that gamer's hoarding mentality though, and was able to sell his entire stash minus the teleportation stone, granting him a total bank of 1,060 gold now. It's in the manhwa that Sung's sword was pretty beat up at this point, and that would lead into the reasoning behind why he chose not to fight with weapons anymore. You see, before he'd once spent $350 on a dagger, and while it definitely made hunting a whole lot easier for him, it unfortunately broke while fighting the boss. His total gains were only 3 essence stones worth of money that day, so with that being only about $240, the money he spent far exceeded the money he'd earned. A costly lesson that made him never want to buy a weapon again. Thus the reason from that point on he only fought with his fists. Now, to add a bit more clarity to the notion this wasn't something Sung understood, there was less uncertainty in the fact he was being manipulated. The way this dungeon worked exactly like a video game made him positive something or someone had created it for him. It was a for sure indicator that some unknown being was controlling him. So, unlike how Sung was just speculating that some higher power wanted him there, in the manhwa he knew this was exactly where they wanted him to be. He was aware he was a pawn in someone else's game, yet continued anyway since this was the only path to power. It's here the novels really flesh out the next part, because there was a lot of focus on what Sung had done to level up some more. He had essentially refined the process into a basic spawn trap system. He discovered the dungeon respawned its monsters on a timer, and it was about the time he took to clear the monsters on the second floor that the lichens on the first would be back and waiting for him. So it was once Sung found out he could just go back and forth between the first and second floor that he would continuously farm all monsters within until his level stopped rising. It was an 8-hour grind in which he had gotten so familiar with that he could now easily predict where the monsters were going to attack him from. Since they would always respawn in the exact same place, every cycle made him more familiar with where each and all of them would come from, turning his grind into a mundane farming route just short of spawn camping. It's an approach that kind of trivializes the trials and tribulations of the first dungeon, but still would have been fun to see him make his way to that point. The manhwa does show it to some capacity, but not to the extent that he's repeating the process multiple times over. It was after this that Sung was now at level 15, and with his agility stat now at a massive 24, he could finally discern what it was that this attribute did for him. It didn't increase physical speed like how he thought, but instead sped up his vision, which in turn made it seem like enemies were slower. So, with each and every time he looped through the dungeon, the creatures he fought gradually became slower to him, eventually getting to the point where all of them moved in what seemed like slow motion to him. It was as if time itself had slowed down. This made it easier to dodge incoming attacks, and that in turn allowed for more opportunity to counterattack. It had created a larger window in which he could attack and his enemies couldn't, a newfound phenomenon that certainly made him feel more agile. This disparity only got larger the more he leveled, and by the time he had peaked at level 15, Sung had come to realize his own movements made himself seem faster to the enemies too. So, with his strength increasing his speed and agility making him see things faster, together they were a double positive that worked both for him and against his enemies. A nice bit of synergy that made combat easier. The next attribute Sung had started to take note of was the way perception made the boss on the 3rd floor seem increasingly dangerous. At first it was only this minor tingling, then the more he leveled and the more perception increased, the more that emanating sense of danger started to feel stronger. Perception didn't just provide some sort of spidey sense though, since as he descended from the 2nd floor down to the 3rd, despite very little light making things visible, Sung could see just fine, likely because of perception too. He believed it went to improve his eyesight as well. It was when Sung finally made it down and encountered the boss that the whole thing was a lot shorter than it was in the anime. The snake got one surprise attack which shattered Sung's sword, then after that it was pretty much game over. All Sung had to do was hone his agility and focus on his target, then maneuver himself in a way that would allow him to grab hold of it. It was a simple task that required only one dodge to do so, the rest of which was just a matter of strength. With almost 50 points now amplifying his power, crushing Kasuka's skull wasn't a matter of if, but rather when. There was no doubt in Sung's mind on whether he could penetrate its armor or not. The only thing Sung was thinking about while doing this was a bunch of what-ifs for the path he took to get here. He wondered if things would have been different had he not power leveled or focused everything on strength. He wondered whether he could have handled the boss if he didn't grind first beforehand. Fortunately, that didn't really matter anymore, as the opportunities Sung saw were the ones he took. A series of cautious decisions that now left him at level 17. Of course, no one really hunted a boss just for experience points, so what Sung was looking forward to the most was the item drops. He was excited to see what loot he would get from the snake he just defeated. Both were the same as what we saw, but the venom wasn't a 35% decrease in strength, but instead just a 35-point decrease. That may seem like a lot right now, but at the later levels when Sung has, say, over 100 strength, a 35-point decrease won't be as much of a debuff as it would be now. To use that potion now would be to deplete pretty much all his strength. Sung would then exit the dungeon, and that would wrap up his intense 9-hour level grind. The reason he still carried his sword is because broken items like that can't be stored in inventory anymore. Now, for a bit more context on the military's involvement with gates, they're usually only ever called in when a dungeon break occurs. Those don't really happen very often anymore, but there are times when a gate would spawn somewhere hidden and go unnoticed. Rare occasions that call for the military to be sent in first, mainly to protect the citizens and buy time for their escape. The other reason is to buy time for the hunters to get there, but with civilians being the highest priority, the military was the willing sacrifice standing between them and the monsters. Noble meat shields who knew their weapons were ineffective, yet proudly defended their fellow countrymen regardless. So, when the soldier who saw Sung thanked him for his service, Sung honestly felt it should have been the other way around. He was surprised to hear gratitude from a person whose life was most at risk here. Either way, it was only natural to appreciate their shared goal of protecting the people. It's when Sung is finally led to where the boss fight is that the situation is shown to be a lot more dire. What I mean is that, with the party wipe being all but inevitable, the tank knew that he would have to be the one to do something. His shield was cracking and the healing just not coming in anymore, so if any of them were gonna make it out alive, there was only one option left for him to choose from, and that was to stay behind while letting everyone else flee. He decided that no one else should have to die, and he alone would buy time so that everyone else could live, hoping that in the time it took for the golem to defeat him, another higher ranked hunter would be able to make it here. So, it was right as this tank was about to give the order that Sung's sword wouldn't just shatter the golem's defenses, but instead straight up one-shot it and explode its head. Only the tank was close enough to see it happen though, so everyone else who was doing damage naturally thought it was them providing the finishing blow to it. It was a mistaken belief that brought with it the misconception that the Essence Stones should be theirs, but that wasn't an argument Sung wanted to get into right now. He didn't have proof that he was the one who slayed it, and even if he did, he would have to reveal how an E rank like him became so powerful. It was a cost that simply wasn't worth the price of a D rank Essence Stone. To him, this unique ability was something far more valuable. So, with that bringing us to the end of the episode, that's pretty much everything we missed from episode 4. A different look into how Sung approached his leveling, and a more detailed overview into how he's adapting to everything. So, if you liked what you saw and want to see more, then be sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments. Now, before I go, a huge thanks to my members and to those supporting through Super Chat. Your direct support is always very much appreciated. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!